Hello, my name is Marie Sarnacki, and I'll be presenting the memory and image of Charlemagne as the once and future crusading emperor. From the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne loomed large in the minds of Europeans. Conflict between petty local rulers and oppression by thuggish warlords over the following centuries led many to long for a lost era of peace and prosperity under the benevolent leadership of a wise, strong, and pious emperor. Though this unambiguously rosy idea of a Carolingian golden age was not entirely accurate, it spurred the creation of legends, epic poems, and artwork depicting Charlemagne as the ultimate religious and political leader. During the 11th through the 13th centuries, Western Europeans began to merge the idea of Charlemagne with the idea of a holy crusade, providing a template of the perfect Christian warrior for crusaders. Why did so many stories about Charlemagne begin to incorporate crusading images and motifs? And why were participants in the Crusades inspired by this idea of Charlemagne? The Crusader Charlemagne motif proliferated and was adopted as a crusading inspiration because Charlemagne represented a model Christian warrior who had just journeyed east, defeated fearsome Muslim foes, and could unite the East and West under a dominant Frankish ruler. The idea of Charlemagne as an aspirational Christian ruler has some basis in the events of his time in power. During his reign as Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne created a strong, centralized government that placed an emphasis on adherence to Christianity and the Christian Church. This marriage of law and religion not only aided Charlemagne in consolidating his power, it also provided the church with an exemplary ruling figure whose goals dovetailed with its own. A striking instance of Charlemagne using Christianity to solidify his own power is the ruler's emphasis on the legal significance of relics. Under Charlemagne, the law changed to require that all oaths be sworn on relics, combining the power of the monarch and the church. Charlemagne also helped cement the church's power through his inclusion of clergy in the empire's administration, as well as his introduction of tithes to the tax system. The Latin Church had a powerful ally and fundraiser in the Holy Roman Emperor. However, this period of relative prosperity and power in the hands of the church and an influential emperor did not last long. After Charlemagne's death, the period of stability that Western Europe had enjoyed came to an abrupt end, and many Europeans were left virtually defenseless against new threats. During this tumultuous period, the memory of Charlemagne as a merciful, devout emperor took on a special significance. His piety stood in stark contrast to the violence of warlords, and his reign became a period upon which many Western Europeans looked back with longing. For the lower classes, the emperor's name was associated with the golden period of peace and stability. For knights and nobles, Charlemagne's traits as a Christian and a ruler were something for which they might strive. It may have been for this reason that the Pope invoked the long-dead emperor's name at the very start of the Crusades. According to some accounts of the call to the First Crusade, Urban II alluded to Charlemagne as an important Christian predecessor and role model for contemporary rulers. Robert the Monk was present at Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095. Although his account was written around 25 years after the event in question, he quotes Urban II referencing Charlemagne as a crusading forebear. Quote, "Let the deeds of your ancestors encourage you and incite your minds to manly achievements, the greatness of King Charlemagne and of his son Louis, and of your other monarchs who have destroyed the kingdoms of the Turks and have extended the sway of church over lands previously possessed by the pagan." Historian J. Puckett provides a plausible explanation for Western Europeans' sense of Charlemagne's ownership over the Holy Land. Puckett places this belief in the cultural and historical context of the Pope's speech. In the decades before Urban II's call to crusade, a new legend developed. Puckett states, according to a popular myth, which first appeared in the mid-11th century, Harun al-Rashid, the Saracen caliph, transmitted to Charlemagne on the day of his coronation the keys to the Holy Sepulchre, citing his fear that the Saracens could no longer keep this holy place safe. This is an early example of a myth in which Charlemagne travels east and gains control over part of Jerusalem. According to this myth, Western Europeans were the heirs of Charlemagne and had inherited his responsibility to protect the Holy Land. To Urban II and his contemporaries, Charlemagne was the originator of a sacred duty to all of Christendom. Urban's speech reflected a popular belief of his time, the belief that Charlemagne was an aspirational figure who had laid before the Crusaders a literal and metaphoric path to victory in the East. If Robert the Monk's account is true, Urban II's statement was indicative of enduring, widespread beliefs in a crusading Charlemagne mythology that had developed over the course of centuries. These fantastic legends would reach their zenith during the first three Crusades. One key element of the crusading Charlemagne motif was the prevalent idea that the emperor had at one point traveled to the Middle East, perhaps even along the same route as that of the Crusaders. In these stories, Charlemagne is almost always depicted as bringing back relics from the Holy Land, a feat actually accomplished by later Crusaders. None of this was based on historical fact. Although Charlemagne had productive diplomatic relationships with some Middle Eastern rulers, he never set foot in the region. Just before the 11th century, however, stories of this fictitious journey east began to propagate throughout Europe. Several historians have recently identified the earliest source of these stories, the Chronicon, written in the 10th century by a monk named Benedict. This narrative includes the fact that Charlemagne returned from this trip bearing relics, reinforcing the emperor's devout Christian faith. The image of Charlemagne as a pious monarch clearly endured in the centuries following the emperor's death. However, there's another possible layer of meaning that likely appealed to crusaders, Western European power. The scholar Anne Latowski notes that relics conferred a sense of strength and power to those who held them. She reads the relic transfer motif in tales of Charlemagne's pilgrimage east as a metaphor for the West's consolidation of political power. This was an appealing idea to many in the West, especially Urban II and participants in the first three Crusades. Another key text is the Pilgrimage of Charlemagne, an epic poem that likely originated in the mid-12th century, at the height of the early Crusades. In this poem, Charlemagne decides to travel to Jerusalem and Constantinople after his wife says that the Byzantine emperor wears his crown better than all other emperors, even Charlemagne. While most scholars interpret this plot as satirical, the poem nevertheless makes use of crusading motifs. Before departing, Charlemagne assembles his vassals and makes known his desire to go on pilgrimage. Charlemagne, who is portrayed as an explicitly French ruler in the poem, seems to echo the actions of nobles who went on crusade, often taking their vassals with them. The next lines describe the emperor's efforts to gather enough money to fund the journey, a consideration that was perhaps influenced by the serious financial risk of going on crusade. The poem spends few lines describing Charlemagne's experiences in Jerusalem, focusing far more on his interactions with the Byzantine emperor. The emperor, Hugo, is portrayed as treacherous, an ally in name only. Hugo's conflict with Charlemagne threatens to lead to violence before Hugo is outwitted by Charlemagne. At the end of the poem, Hugo becomes Charlemagne's vassal and hands over control of the kingdom. This is a common theme in stories about Charlemagne's journey east, the hope for a reunion of Eastern and Western Christendom, albeit only if the West is dominant. By the end of the poem, Charlemagne has overcome Byzantine treachery, gained territory, and returned home bearing relics. Another source connecting Charlemagne to the Crusades is the Charlemagne window in Chartres Cathedral. A careful examination of this artwork reveals how the story of Charlemagne's pilgrimage east evolved into a crusade narrative. This window not merely places scenes with Charlemagne next to scenes from the First Crusade, but actually depicts Charlemagne himself on crusade in the Middle East. The panels that form what scholar Clark Maines has titled the Jerusalem Crusade Cycle show Charlemagne fighting Saracens in the Middle East. The explicit focus on Charlemagne traveling east in order to fight Muslims is a significant departure from other portrayals of the legendary journey, and it cannot be easily traced to a previous source. Maines interprets this shift as a result of consolidating pre-existing ideas with the contemporaneous zeitgeist of a society preoccupied with the Crusades. Scholar Matthew Gabriel discusses how the Chartres window represents a larger change in the public's understanding of Charlemagne as a literal crusader. By the 13th century, Gabriel claims, one writer could comfortably state that the Crusade of 1095 was actually the second because Charlemagne had staged the first. The window represents the evolution in the image of Charlemagne from pilgrim and eastward traveler to a crusader in his own right. Many medieval texts that portray Charlemagne as a crusader fighting Muslims set the story in Spain. There is some basis to this in historical truth. Charlemagne indeed fought against certain Muslim Spanish groups during the period of Islamic control of Iberia. However, this campaign did not result in a Frankish victory and was not an especially notable episode in the emperor's life. The stories told by medieval texts paint a different picture. In chansons de geste, such as the Song of Roland, Charlemagne liberates all of Spain from Muslim rule and goes on to continue the crusade in other parts of the world. These stories depict Charlemagne as an crusader whose piety and valor could be a model for crusading Christians of the 11th through 13th centuries. Perhaps the best-known work of literature regarding Charlemagne's Spanish conquest is the Song of Roland. This epic poem was almost certainly created at some point during the first two Crusades, with most scholars theorizing that it originated in the late 11th century. The poem is set in Spain at the end of Charlemagne's fictional reconquest of the peninsula. The poem ends by looking to a crusading future. After experiencing great personal tragedy in battle, Charlemagne cannot rest. In the last lines of the poem, the angel Gabriel appears to the emperor and gives him a message from God. He tells Charlemagne to continue crusading in the east. Contemporary events influenced the portrayal of an emperor who had been dead for centuries, marrying the past and present to create a relevant crusading image. Charlemagne's cultural ubiquity meant that the dead could not stay dead, at least in legends surrounding the Crusades. During the First Crusade, the rumor spread that Charlemagne himself would return to lead the Christian armies and usher in the end of days. Whether this belief was widespread is difficult to determine, but many scholars have noted that the Holy Land was expected to be retaken during the apocalypse. Even as European Christians fought and died in the Holy Land, the Charlemagne legend continued to grow and change in order to fit relevant narratives. While the inspiration for the Crusades cannot be limited to one idea, the memory of Charlemagne played a significant role in its relationship to the Crusades. The imagined life of the emperor served as an example of piety and valor, evolving over time and eventually conforming to the exact ideal of the Crusades. The influence of Charlemagne would ripple through the ages, touching all of Europe and the Holy Land.